Chapter 1. The Britishness of British Politics. British people would defend to the death the right of a worker to withdraw his labour, but they draw the line at strikes. Michael Frayn. Try this game. You have to fill in the blank. French wine, Italian food, German cars, British. Not easy, is it? One of my children suggested humour, but that could scarcely be a British gift to the world if nobody else could understand the joke. Another came up with language, which would be the obvious candidate, except for the fact that it is not English, but British that we are talking about. A characteristic confusion that it will be necessary to say something more about shortly. So, as my children put it, what's the clever clog answer then? There is a good case to be made for politics or government. This is not an original answer. Indeed, it has long been held, not least by the British, that Britain has displayed a particular approach to politics that has offered lessons to the world in making. Government work. This country's distinctive contribution to civilization, proclaimed the Daily Telegraph not so very long ago, has been the development of stable institutions of representative government, 19th December 1997. There is plenty to unpick in such a statement. Which country precisely? What kind of stability? Does representative mean democratic? But it faithfully echoes a long line of such judgments about the political genius and blessings of the British. These judgments have been delivered by domestic voices and by foreign observers, by rhetoric politicians and by dispassionate scholars, and by radicals and conservatives. A quick sample might include the following. In 1865, the radical John Bright famously described the country as the mother of parliaments. At the end of the Second World War, Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the House of Commons, "If it be true, as has been said, that every country gets the form of government it does, we may certainly flatter ourselves. The wisdom of our ancestors has led us to an envied and enviable situation. We have the strongest parliament in the world. We have the oldest, the most famous, the most secure, the most serviceable monarchy in the world. King and parliament both rest safely and solidly upon the will of the people, expressed by free and fair election on the basis of universal suffrage. Thus the system has long worked harmoniously both in peace and in war." 15th of May 1945. In the 1950s, Andrew Mayor, in his French study of British politics, described the British system as an enviable model of democratic government, while adding, "One can only regret that it could not possibly be transplanted to any other country." In their classic comparative study of democracies published in 1963, the American political scientists Almond and Verber identified Britain as the exemplar of a successful civic culture. Then, finally, in the contemporary political scientist Richard Rose, who introduced his textbook on the politics of England, yes, England, with the observation that just as Alexis de Tocqueville travelled to America in 1831 to seek the secrets of democracy, so one might journey to England to seek the secrets of stable representative government. It is not difficult to see why the British model, as it sometimes came to be called, acquired this status. After all, compared with the most other societies in Europe, Britain has enjoyed a long and remarkable history of political stability in modern times. Just to take the last 100 years, while countries like France and Germany were regularly making and unmaking their political systems under the impact of war, occupation, extremism, violence, revolutionary, and tyranny, Britain stayed firmly on the path of parliamentary democracy. This was a remarkable achievement, especially in the turbulent circumstances on the first half of the 20th century. It merited a proper amount of self-congratulation, except from those who wanted to bring the house down. But as ever, There is more to be said about the Britishness of British politics than this kind of comfortable summary allows for. Up until the time of the French Revolution, at the end of the 18th century, it was Britain's revolutionary history that defined its political tradition, and the British had a European reputation, whether admired or abhorred, as a political volatile people given to regicide and rebellion. Lively and lively democracy in Britain, a reader. In the 17th century, Britain was a pretty bloody place, nor has the modern period been without its share of turbulence and upheaval. At some moments, accurately so. Indeed, in the 1970s, the British model ceased to be the object of envy and emulation and came to be seen as the European basket case, the home of an adversarial kind of politics that prevented effective policy making and brought the country to its knees. One does not have to be a doom-monger, wrote the political scientist Anthony King in 1975, to sense that something is wrong with our politely as well as our economy. This is a reminder of a larger point, that political stability of the British kind is not the same as policy successes. As the post-war British economy record makes clear, the lines of connection and disconnection in this area are much more complex. Then there is the Irish question. After conventionally forgotten, when the eulogies to the British politely are being composed, which has periodically brought violence and terror into a political system celebrated for its orderly continues, from the beginning of the modern troubles in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s until the end of the 20th century. A citizen of Northern Ireland was over 200 times more likely to die from sequential violence than a citizen of India, a chilling reminder that a very different kind of political substance is lodged within the famously well-functioning bloodstream of the British body politic. Northern Ireland is the standing exception to any generalization about modern British politics, which is why it has often been dropped from the picture altogether, until it has exploded in its way in again, and why the peace process and power sharing rooted in the historic Good Friday Agreement of 1998 still remains a work in progress. This is just the most glaring example of a more general tendency among the British not to know about or care about who they are. In part, at least, this is the luxury available to a settled people. It can also be a myope, or worse. The English have always been the worst offenders, feeling no need to look beyond the end of their comfortable noses at the nature of the multinational state of which they are an overwhelmingly dominant part. This is why they have had trouble in coming to terms with devolution, and have shown no desire to embrace it for themselves. But the tendency is a general one. The terms England and Britain and Great Britain and United Kingdom are constantly used and misused by people who have no idea what they mean or how they are different, or what their historical provenance is. There can scarcely have been a state in which its citizens were so hopelessly muddled about what they lived. As the historian Norman Davies puts it in his epic moment and account of the Isles, one of the most extraordinary aspects of the current scene lies in the number of citizens of the United Kingdom who do not appear to be familiar with the basic parameters of the state in which they live. They often do not know what it is called. They do not distinguish between the whole and the constituent parts, and they have never grasped the most elementary facts of its development. Confusion reigns on every hand. A good example is accidentally provided by the American writer Bill Bryson in his best-selling account of his journeying around Britain, searching for the grave of George Orwell in Nuneham, Contrary Cemetery in Oxfordshire. He comes upon the grave of Asquith, who had been Prime Minister at the height of the British Empire in the early 20th century. Bryson is surprised that the inscription on the headstone describes Asquith as having been Prime Minister of England. He should have been surprised. This is entirely typical of the prevailing confusions and illusions. The opening sentence of D.L. Keir's standard work on the constitutional history of modern Britain reads, "Continuity has been the dominant characteristic in the development of English government." He might have added that confusion had been dominant characteristic in descriptions of the British polity. Yet the confusion is the reality. It can seem merely pedantic to try to hang on to some proper distinctions and definitions, that Britain is not an island, that England, the part, is not Britain, the whole, that Great Britain refers to England, Scotland, and Wales, the single kingdom created by the Treaty of Union between England and Scotland in 1707, that the United Kingdom refers to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, established in 1921, and ending the 1801 union of Great Britain with Ireland, the former United Kingdom. Although the state has undergone major structural transformations since 1707, in 1801 and 1921, the catch-all term British that was invented in the 18th century has endured. It may be a word in search of a definition, but in its imposition, it has also been characteristically British. The style guide provided by the Guardian newspaper for its journalists offers an example of an interesting attempt to traverse this conceptual bog. Here is an extract from it. Britain/UK, these terms are synonymous, despite what might have been told. Britain is the official short form of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Used as adjectives, therefore, Britain and UK mean the same. Great Britain, however, refers only to the mainland of England, Wales, and Scotland. Great Britain, England, Wales, and Scotland. If you want to include Northern Ireland, use Britain or UK. England, take care not to offend by saying England or English when you mean Britain or British. Although, along with its further advice on how to negotiate the linguistic and political minefields associated with Ulster and Ireland, this probably takes us just about as far as we can usefully go on this front. It is quite enough to show that the Britishness of British politics comes laden with ambiguities. These have recently had to be confronted as devolution has unpacked one version of the United Kingdom and replaced it with another. But old habits nevertheless die hard. Old habits are almost the product of long experience. The identification of ambiguities and confusions in the British political experience should not be allowed to obscure these distinctive features which may have given the political system its underlying shape and form. Many of these are buried deep in history, geography, culture, and social structure. The question of what causes what, for example, is Britain's long history of political stability a product of its political system, or its stable political system a product of a unified society and an uninterpreted history, is endlessly asked and perennially unanswered. The truth is that everything connects with everything else, shaping and being shaped in turn. How could it be otherwise? Fortunately, this need not detain us unduly here, except as a preface to logging some of the indispensable shaping factors in the making of British politics. Many of these are well rehearsed and require little further embellishment. However, this does not diminish their significance or their continuing impact. The fact of geography that separated Britain from the continental landmass of Europe meant that it was unlikely to be a normal European power. It has had no experience of successful invasion or occupation since 1066. When the countries of Europe emerged from the Second World War with the belief that the nation-state had failed, requiring new pan-European political institutions to be built, Britain believed instead that it had triumphed. It was the nation's finest hour. When Britain stood alone, it is impossible to understand the subsequent history of Britain's troubled relationship with Europe, without also understanding the force of these different historical and geographical trajectories. It explains why Euroscepticism has been much stronger in Britain than in the rest of the EU, and why Britain has acquired its awkward partner status. Britain avoided other major repertoires too, or to at least got them out of the way early enough to permit several centuries of orderly political evolution and continuity. Britain knew all about religious strife and struggles over the control of the state, but believed that these had largely been settled by the end of the 17th century. In the modern period, since the French Revolution, although Britain has felt the force of the battles over nationhood, rights, freedom, democracy, and class that have shaped the modern history of Europe, it avoided an experience of decisive repertoire. Without a modern revolutionary moment, Britain was not compelled to remake its political institutions, draw up a new constitution, or decide what kind of state it wanted to be. It just went on being what it was, more or less. This might be seen as a peculiar blessing, or as a kind of curse, but it is a fundamental fact about British politics. This is usually described in the language of adaptation and flexibility, on which more will be said in the next chapter, on the Constitution. It has also been described less pompously as muddling through or make it up as you go along politics, or by Peter Hennessy. As the politics of a back-of-the-envelope nation, it is reflected in the visible continuity of the institutional landscape, still in the 21st century with a monarchy and a House of Lords, and in the predilection for not abolishing anything if it can be induced to mutate and evolve, new bits may be added on. But odd bits are rarely taken away. This is why British politics looks so familiar, never more so than when the Queen arrives in all her majesty to perform the state opening of Parliament and to read out the gracious speech in which she announces what my government and ministers are intending to do. David Cameron spars with Ed Miliband across the 2 sword lengths width of the House of Commons chamber, much as Churchill and Attlee did half a century ago, and Gladstone and Disraeli a century earlier. Even when the reality is changed, the outward appearance of British politics looks reassuringly the same. It is always difficult to judge at any single moment whether a political tradition is changing its underlying character as a consequence of particular events or altered circumstances, or whether its broad continuities are still intact. British politics have regularly been described by commentators over the years as being in transition. It is a question much discussed again now. Constitutional charges and changes are making their impacts felt, along with significant shifts in Britain's society, economy, and culture. A succession of recent crises in Parliament, in finance, and in the media have rocked institutions and damaged trust. The failure of the 2010 general election to produce a winning majority for any party for the first time in the country's post-1945 history signalled a new political environment, just as the prospect of prolonged austerity following the financial crash represented a new economic environment. We shall have to return to what all this means for British politics in the final chapter. One thing is certain. It is much easier to identify what the Britishness of British politics has considered of in the past than what it might consist of now or in the future. For example, an old examination question on British politics courses used to ask students to discuss Balfour's remark about the British being a people so fundamentally at one that they can safely afford to bicker. This seemed to be a truism about the British political culture, an expression of a fundamental unity that transcended differences and so enabled the political system to achieve a stable continuity. Of course, it was never quite as simple as that, but it does nevertheless identify a crucial feature of the British political experience. George Orwell put his finger on this in the 1940s when he described how the proletariat of Hammersmith will not arise and massacre the bourgeoisie of Kensington. they are not different enough. Britain, and England in particular, was exceptionally marked by its class divisions. The English were the only European people who sorted themselves out by class at mealtimes, observed A.J.P. Taylor. The masses took their principal meal at midday, their betters in the evening. But Britain was also marked by the extent of its overarching social unity. Reform, not revolution, was the watchword. Parliament, not the barricades, was the route of advance. This unity was held by the Empire, a profoundly British experience in which all could share. It brought the separate nations of class of Britain under its generous wing. As people learned to paint the world red, that is why the retreat from empire memorably captured in US Secretary of State Dean Aikeson's remark in 1962 that Great Britain has lost an empire and has not found a role, produced prolonged policy agonizing about the country's place in the world. The common experience of war, especially the two great conflicts of the 20th century, further strengthened social unity. It was also helped by the particular nature of the demand for welfare and social justice, which framed itself in class rather than territorial terms, joining Clydeside and the Rhodander Cockneys with the Geordies, looked for British solutions of the kind exemplified by the National Health Service and found in the British Labour government, a political instrument that gave its local idiom and integrated it, established constitutional procedures and institutions. This is a bold summary of a rich history, but it is an indispensable part of any understanding of British politics. It is not that Britain lacks differences. These remain sharp and marked of class, ethnicity, culture, generation, region, nation, religion, and much else, and some grow sharper, new issues appear as old ones subside, and traditional attitudes, such as deference, trust, and duty, are replaced by a skeptical questioning of authority and even a willingness to kick over the traces at times. The fragmentation of a traditional class structure has brought with it a political fragmentation. All this demands caution in making generalizations, yet it has undoubtedly been the case, and remains so to a significant extent, that the commonality of British society has given a particular character to its politics. It has not been necessary, at least not until recently, and always with Northern Ireland as the standing exception, to structure political life around religions, ethnicity, or territorial divisions, as it has often been necessary to do elsewhere. Nor is there any regionalization of political life that is common in much of Europe, with proud provincial capitals and strong regional newspapers. In Britain, all political roads have traditionally led to London. People have overwhelmingly read the same newspapers, watched the same television programs, and participated in the same national convention, with the BBC as a core British institution. The post-devolution row over whether the BBC's 6 o'clock news bulletin should be British or Scottish brought this contested commonality into sharp relief, with devolution itself was just one indication among others that a more differentiated society would involve important consequences for the political system. The old building blocks of Britishness may now be weakening, and in need of replacement or reinvention. The legacy of empire has produced a population that is much more divisive, giving rise to arguments about the relationship between Britishness and multiculturalism, with David Cameron attacking state multiculturalism in a speech in 2011 and identifying it as a contributing factor to extremism and Islamic terrorism. While immigration has become a potent and often toxic political issue, at the same time, devolution strengthened separate identities and threatened to take Britain apart. Perhaps this is why the popular celebration of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012, followed by national pride in the success of Team GB in the London Olympics of that year, could feel to many like a badly needed reaffirmation of a Britishness that had been much less sure of itself than it had been 60 years earlier. But that is to run ahead. Speculation about where British politics might be going has to wait until we have established where it has come from, and how its essential character has been formed. What is this essential character? It has been distinguished by a striking simplicity. This can be a shock for the system for those accustomed to more elaborately ordered political arrangements elsewhere. Raymond Seitz, a recent American ambassador to Britain, describes in his Over Here what it was like to leave the tortuous legislative process of Washington and arrive in the brutal simplicities of Westminster. Coming from this kind of fractious federal background, an American arrives on British shores, astonished to discover how unfettered a modern British government is. When I first lived here in the mid-1970s, it took me a long time to understand that a British government with a simple majority in the House of Commons can do pretty much what it wants to. If the party in power can count on having one or more warm body in its lobby than all the other bodies combined in the other lobby, there is nothing preventing the government having its way. I kept looking for constitutional checks and institutional balances that could stay the will of a British government, but I could find none. In face of such arbitrary omnipotence, I could suddenly imagine myself as an American revolutionary grabbing my flintlock from the wall above the fireplace and rushing into the forest to take a few pot shots at the redcoats. This is often described as the British tradition of strong government. It is said to reflect both a particular history and the temper of a people. It was forged out of a state that had early on established a centralized grip on its territory, earlier and tighter than elsewhere. Even though monarchs had to learn to govern with the consent of representatives, eventually having to settle for a crown in parliament arrangement that concealed a fundamental shift in the balance of power, what remained intact was a governing tradition. The identity of those doing the governing may have altered, but the activity of governing remained remarkably unchanged. The arrival of democratic politics did little to disrupt the tradition, perhaps even strengthening it by endowing it with an enhanced legitimacy. It was a governing arrangement that was top-down rather than bottom-up. Power was centralized and concentrated. It enabled governments to grow, or so it was said. It was a very British arrangement in its governing simplicity. Government was craft, not an artifact. It required, not elaborate.